In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Very nice to be with you here. We've devoted another episode here to the relationship between science and faith, and for those of you who have been following along with our programs on a regular basis, just several episodes ago, we had been we invited Fuzz Rana and Michael Strauss onto the program to talk about that relationship between science and faith. And I thought we should go a little bit more in depth, and so we've invited on Melissa Cain Travis to talk about her recent book, Science and the Mind of the Maker, what the conversation between faith and science reveals about God. Melissa Cain Travis is the author of this book. She's a assistant professor of Christian apologetics at Houston Baptist University. She's a contributing author to The Story of the Cosmos, which is a very heavy illustration, photograph-filled work, which we'll ask her about a little bit later on, and also has an interesting children's series book, which I want to ask her about. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us on the program today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so, okay, before we jump into Science and the Mind of the Maker, let me ask you about your Young Defender series.
So, back when I was still a master's student at Biola University, I had the idea of producing a series of children's apologetics books that were written in fiction story form. So I approached a publisher, Apologia Press, which is based in Western North Carolina, pitched them the idea. They loved it. So from 2012 to 2016, we released one book a year. So it's a 4-book series. The very first book addresses the existence of God. It's called How Do We Know God Is Really There? And it was based upon a conversation that I had had in real life with my older son, who was only 7 years old at the time. And so after that book came out, I thought, well, what would be the next logical step in the series? And I thought, well, how about the design of life? So the second book is called How Do We Know God Created Life? And then the third book, How Do We Know Jesus is Alive, which is a defense of the resurrection of Jesus. And then finally, How Do We Know Right from Wrong, which is a kid version of the moral argument for the existence of God.
And how long are these books?
They're not long at all. You can sit down and read one of the stories in one sitting with your child at bedtime. I mean,
oh, yeah, nice.
Read aloud, probably 15 or 20 minutes.
Oh, that's great. Nice. Awesome. And what age range would you recommend the book?
You know, when I was working with my illustrator, his name is Christopher Voss, and he's actually a rather celebrated artist who lives out in West Texas. He exhibits all over the country, but his background in college was cartooning. And so I thought, how can I make these stories come alive for the younger end of the elementary age school spectrum? So fun illustrations to capture their attention, but then using language that's not so dumbed down that kids in like the 11 and 12 year age range can't appreciate what the story's teaching. So it's a rather broad age range that the books are aimed at. I usually say 7 years old to 11 or 12.
Yeah.
And some of the feedback I've received is that some of the older kids, they first see the illustrations and they think, wow, am I too old for this? But then as the story unfolds, they're captivated. So that was just my and my illustrator's attempt to cast as wide of a net as we could.
Yeah, very nice. That's great. So yeah, children's author, but also high-level academic as well. You've got an interest in science. So what got you interested in studying that field?
So I've loved science my entire life. As a kid in elementary school, I can tell you that the highlight of my week, every single week, even back to kindergarten, was getting to watch, we called them film strips back then. That really dates me, right? We didn't even have VCRs in the classroom at that time. We had film strip machines. But my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. McIntosh, would show these awesome film strips about dinosaurs. And so science captured my imagination from a very, very young age. Grew up loving science, getting very interested in biology and biochemistry. So I went on to university to do a bachelor's degree in general biology. And in the years between finishing a bachelor's degree and starting the master's program at Biola, I worked in the field of biotechnology.
Yeah.
So I worked for a firm here in the Woodlands that did actually experimentation on mice for the purpose of the pharmaceutical industry. So that was interesting.
Lab testing.
And then I thought, there's a very long backstory that happened during all that time that got me interested in apologetics. But just suffice it to say that when I learned about Biola offering a master's program in science and religion, I knew immediately that's what I was cut out to do. So I kind of changed career paths, but my science background has served me very, very well all along the way, and I still use it.
Nice. Okay, so as we get into the content of your book, you start off by sort of clearing some of the baggage that might associate itself with discussions of science and faith. Tell us a little bit about maybe some of what I'm calling that baggage.
Yeah, so unfortunately, when you talk to the average Christian layperson about the science and faith conversation, or you talk about the intersection of science and Christianity, the first place their mind will usually go is the big in-house debate over the age of the earth, the age of the universe, or the disputes over whether or not the theory of biological evolution is true. And what I do at the outset of the book is I say, look, my philosophy of approaching the science and faith conversation is something that I call mere creation. And for those that are familiar with C.S. Lewis's famous book, Mere Christianity, they'll already have a little bit of an idea about what I mean by that. And specifically what I mean is I want to talk about the science and faith intersection at a much higher level than those in-house concerns. I want to talk about the most fundamental questions. Is there a God or is there not? What can science imply either way? So I want to find that wonderful common ground between the believer and the non-believer. What can we look at together and have a conversation about the possible implications of what it is we observe in the various scientific disciplines? I think that's so much more productive than Christians getting bogged down in their in-house fights about how to interpret the first chapter of Genesis and so on and so forth.
Now, the idea of looking at science, looking at the world through the lens of science or the method of science, and reflecting about a creator is something that we humans have been doing for a very long time. Tell me about maybe where it began to happen when people were devoting themselves to that endeavor.
There's a long back history. Long back history. So in the book, I take my readers all the way back to ancient Greece, to the pre-Socratic era, and by that I mean before Socrates and Plato, back to a very shadowy figure named Pythagoras of Samos. So Pythagoras left behind no writings of his own. We have to kind of wade through what was left behind by those who later on claimed to be Pythagoreans or followers of the oral teachings of Pythagoras to get an idea of what he might have taught. And we can't arrive at any certainty on that. We do our best. And I talk about that a whole lot more in my dissertation than I did in the book, for obvious reasons.
Is this the same Pythagoras as a squared plus b squared equals c squared from freshman geometry class?
Yes, so that's talking about the exact same Pythagoras, but that theorem, the Pythagorean theorem, is only attributed to Pythagoras through tradition. We have no way of confirming that this was something that he developed himself, but we can say that it was the Pythagoreans, the self-labeled Pythagoreans, who eventually developed some of the different mathematics that we attribute to Pythagoras. Interestingly, back in May, I was teaching at Summit Ministries up in Manitou Springs, Colorado, and I'm talking about Pythagoras in my first talk with these high school students. And I said, can anyone tell me the Pythagorean theorem? And way off to the right, some gloriously geeky student raises his hand and he tells me the Pythagorean theorem. And right after he does, some gloriously something other kind of student over to my left starts making vomiting noises. And so now I can say that it has been my experience at least once that someone made vomiting noises during one of my talks.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So anyway, all of that to say, so Pythagoras, the Pythagorean idea that I develop both in Science and the Mind of the Maker and some of my higher level work is that this idea that number or mathematics is somehow fundamental to material reality. Okay, so this was an idea that became very, very influential in Western thought. Pythagoreanism influenced Plato, and as you probably heard it said, everything in Western philosophy since Plato is just a footnote to Plato. So Plato's influence is pervasive, especially within Christian theology. But we fast forward a little bit more and we get to Jewish monotheism, which was incorporating Platonic ideas, including the idea of mathematics or number somehow pervading the material creation, with Philo of Alexandria, who was a Hellenistic Jew. And then we get to Augustine of Hippo, one of our most influential Western church fathers, who talked about this idea of God having a rational plan in mind when he created the world. So the rest is pretty much history. I could just go on and take you all the way up to contemporary science and theology, but there's a little background.
Yeah, well, I know that chapter 4 kind of looks at other thinkers. You've called them the priests in God's cosmic temple, and that was fascinating to me. As you talked about, there's a lot of misconceptions out there in science and faith discussions, and but the modern day scientific movement, if I could call it that, correct me if I'm mistaken, basically had its founding from Christian thinkers who wanted to explore the universe to see God's handiwork.
That's exactly right. So they became scientific, and I'm trying to remember who it was that said it this way. I know John Lennox has said this, and I can't remember if he was quoting someone else when he made this statement, but that men became scientific and came to believe in rational laws of the universe because they believed in a lawgiver. So they expected to find orderliness in the cosmos and not chaos. And that drove them in their endeavor to do what Johannes Kepler called thinking God's thoughts after him. They wanted to know more about the mind of the Creator, and they felt that they could do a wonderful job of that through investigating what the Creator actually made for us to observe.
So this is going to be a very basic question. So you said Johannes Kepler. Remind us what Kepler is known for.
Okay, so Johannes Kepler was one of the giants of the scientific revolution. He's remarkable for many different things. He's my hero. I have a cat named Kepler. He's actually sitting on my feet right now. So Johannes Kepler was a really interesting pivotal figure in the history of science. For one thing, he was a devout Christian. He was a Lutheran, but he was a Lutheran during the Counter-Reformation. So he was in a hostile climate his entire life. Since he wasn't Roman Catholic, but he also disagreed with some Lutheran theology, it ended up being impossible for him to secure an academic post. So he lived a life on the verge of poverty and endured a whole lot of hardship. He lost several children early in their lives. He lost his wife at a young age. It came at him from every direction, but through it all, he persevered in this remarkable faith. And his writings are just infused with his praises to the Creator. And if you didn't have a biography of Johannes Kepler, you would never, ever know what a very difficult life he led. But as far as his contributions to Western science, he's the one that was responsible for the famous 3 laws of planetary motion. For example, law number 1 is that planets orbit the sun in an ellipse rather than a perfect circle, just to give you an example. So his work became a foundational to the work that Isaac Newton did in developing his universal laws of gravitation. So that's usually how people who have only studied science at the high school level may remember Johannes Kepler. But he was such a pivotal figure because he was the thinker who transformed ancient astronomy to a true theoretical science. So he was the one that said, let's do away with a lot of this preconceived notion about what the heavens should look like, how they should operate, and let's take the best observations we have and apply good mathematics and see what's really going on. And so that was just a remarkable feat, especially for someone living at the time that he did, having very, very poor eyesight, never having the money to even own a telescope, but yet to do the remarkable things that he did. So.
He sounds like many folks with a PhD looking for a teaching gig,
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so Kepler is just one of the names. I want to, again, this might be very basic, but I want to learn more about the other fellows in that chapter. You've got, I think, 4 different names.
Okay, so how about Galileo?
That could be, yeah. And I know Boyle. Boyle is one of those that I rarely have heard of, but...
Isn't that interesting? So Boyle is one of those who, along with Johannes Kepler, and quite honestly, one thing I need to research is whether or not he got this phrase from Kepler or if he came up with it all on his own. But he and Kepler both used that phrase, priests of creation. So this idea that in studying the world, we're carrying out this divine liturgy, that scientists are uncovering things about the character of God, the power of God, and even the existence of God. Boyle was actually very, very interested in the project of Christian apologetics. And there was a whole series of Christian apologetics lectures that came to be named after him. He left behind a monetary legacy that funded what are now referred to as the Boyle Lectures. And the purpose, his vision for those, was for the discoveries of science to be able to be pressed into service for the project of Christian apologetics. So Boyle, another devout Christian, he was much more interested in the biological side of things and making arguments from biological design. But one thing he had in common with Kepler that I think is so fantastic, and it's a topic that's probably my favorite, is this idea that man, being made in the image of God, unlike any other creature in the universe, is able to do science and is able to know God through the scientific endeavor.
Great. Okay, how about Galileo? And then after him, Newton. I think those are the 4.
Yeah. Okay, so Galileo was a contemporary of Johannes Kepler. They never met in person, but they did correspond with each other. And Galileo was doing all the telescopic observation of the time that was lending support to this newfangled theory. Well, not that it had never been conceived before, but rising to prominence, I guess, at the time was the theory of heliocentrism, the idea that the sun is at the center with the planets revolving around, rather than Earth being at the center with the sun and everything else revolving around the Earth. So that's what Galileo is chiefly known for, is his telescopic observations that lent support to heliocentrism. So he and Kepler corresponded some, and it's really unfortunate that Galileo ultimately did not incorporate Kepler's mathematics. Because by the end of his life, Galileo still had not used the most up-to-date astronomy and mathematical theory that was available to him. And there's all sorts of theories for why he was too stubborn to do it. Galileo quite liked attention and personal glory. So maybe it was just in an effort to keep the spotlight on himself exclusively. Who knows? But anyway, Kepler and Galileo's work taken together, which is what Sir Isaac Newton did, when Isaac Newton talked about having stood on the shoulders of giants to reach the scientific heights that he did, Kepler and Galileo were the two main ones that he was referring to implicitly. So then we have Sir Isaac Newton developing the universal law of gravitation, taking all the observations and all the wonderful mathematics and bringing them together into a theory where we could have a set of universal mathematical laws of nature that can apply not just to the courses of the planets in the heavens, but also to terrestrial physics. Galileo had experimented a lot with things like launched cannonballs and dropping objects of different masses off of towers and things like that. So Newton was able to take all of that and incorporate it into what we now refer to as the Newtonian system of physics.
I can only imagine what that would have been like back then. Today we have these official, lab experiments, and we have whole buildings maybe designated to running experiments. I know that there are buildings that will create a vacuum. There are buildings that will smash particles, machinery in the buildings that will smash particles. But back in Newton's day, he probably climbed up the church bell tower and was like, yeah, I'm just going to drop this watermelon and see what happens.
Right. Yes, totally. Totally.
So people probably would have been looking at him like, hey, that is so weird. Why would you waste that watermelon?
Yeah, right.
Now, the God hypothesis here, these were Christian men, but even long before them, there was this hypothesis that there's this unmoved mover. And there were ancient scientists wanting to study more about the universe, to understand if there are normal, what we call laws, which govern the way the world works. But this God hypothesis comes in not through scientists, but the philosophers. And I know one of the most famous philosophers of history is Aristotle. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about his interest in at least the God hypothesis.
Right. So I wouldn't say that Aristotle was necessarily someone who was on a mission to prove the existence of God. But Aristotle did write quite a bit about this idea of there having to be a first unmoved mover, that we can't just go into an infinite regress of explanation when we're trying to get at the original first cause of everything. In other words, there had to be an original first cause. And so then Aristotle's thought went on to be highly influential, particularly in Christian theology, disseminated chiefly, not exclusively, but chiefly through the work of Thomas Aquinas, the great philosopher and theologian. So Aristotle's thought has been very useful in the contemporary project of Christian apologetics. I think we see glimmers of it in some of the more recent versions of what we call the cosmological arguments, for example. And I think we owe him a great debt, just as I think we owe Plato a great debt for the work that us today are trying to accomplish in areas of philosophy of religion and in apologetics.
Yeah, very nice. Melissa, we're going to take a short break here. When we come back, though, I want to pick your brain more about the design argument, fine-tuning, also the theory of evolution and whether that goes against the God hypothesis. So stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Let's say there's this Christian apologist. You love their message, but have trouble finding their videos, their articles, or social media posts. How do you stay connected to them? We're on it. Defenders Media uses the tools of the digital age to create content for your favorite apologists. We give them more screen time, more digital soapboxes, and more presence to deliver more of the content that you love. That's what we do.
I know that social media is important to those of you who follow my work. Many respond to my videos and posts on Facebook and Twitter, but it becomes impossible after a while to keep up with it all and to continue with research. That's why I'm thrilled that we have found a solution, Defenders Media.
Whether it's a website, whether it's printed material, whether it's a question on graphics, I cannot do what I do and reach my audience without the help of Defenders Media. They have been integral in helping me to reach my audience.
Defenders Media ensures consistent content reaches your hand from today's leading apologists and apologetic ministries, like Mike Lycona, Apologetics 315, the Veracity Hill podcast with Kurt Jarris, and more.
To learn more, text the word Defenders to 555-888 and we'll send you a free PDF of the top 5 ways to share the gospel online. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you'd like to learn how you can become a sponsor, you can go to our website, veracityhill.com, click on that patron tab, and you can see the sponsorship levels. Also, we would love to get your support as a patron, a listener of our program. Those are folks that just chip in a few bucks each month, $5, $10, $20 a month. And if you support our program at $20 a month or more, we send you as a thank you gift, a PDF or a flash drive with some of our PDF files and some of our programs as well. I found it there on my desk. And what's nice about these flash drives are you got the basic USB, and then you also have the USB-C, which is kind of neat. It can go into the newer Macs, also your phones as well. Android phones that will take that as a data source. So pretty neat there. On today's program, I'm joined by Melissa Cain Travis. She is a Assistant Professor of Christian Apologetics at Houston Baptist University and the author of Science and the Mind of the Maker, What the Conversation Between Faith and Science Reveals About God. Now, Melissa, you said this is just the 1-year anniversary of the book, and I know you've done plenty of interviews over the years. Let me ask you this. What's been one of the most fun engagements you've had as a result of the book?
Oh, the most fun. What would that be?
So have you done like any debates with folks over it, or just a fun lecture, any public talks?
So I've done a lot of public talks, a lot of local teaching on it. I did have a debate invitation that I turned down. I am just not a debater. I've never debated, and I've never studied debate method. And so my feeling is, since I've never been educated in those areas, I should leave the debating to those who are exceptionally skilled in debate, right?
Yeah.
So I did receive an invitation as the result of the publication of the book from a rather well-known atheist who lives in Austin, Texas, who shall remain nameless, and I turned it down.
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, I know you know who I'm talking about. But I have to say my most memorable feedback on the book was this email that I received maybe not even a month after the book came out. And it was from a pastor's wife up in one of the Midwestern states. And she told me a bit of her backstory, having grown up in a very strict legalistic church. She is now a pastor's wife, but had been in a major crisis of faith. And what she said to me in her email was, not a week before your book came out, I had finally concluded that I needed to try on atheism for size, because she couldn't reach any sort of comfortable place that helped her harmonize reason and faith.
Yeah.
And voracious reader. And she said, I saw your book. I bought it on impulse. And by the time I got to chapter 3, I was already back to theism.
Yeah.
And so it's been wonderful. We connected on social media, and it's been wonderful to kind of watch her climb her way out of that dark place of doubt where my book happened to find her. So that's probably my favorite story.
Yeah, that's great. And it's, to me, that's just, it's a reminder, sometimes a sad reminder, of the failure of the Christian church to let people know about the resources. I mean, a pastor's wife,
Right.
So it's not like someone who's just, maybe on the fence about Christian faith, but someone who's involved and active in a Christian community, so that the church just has loads of work to do. And I'm not saying, some people say, well, you need an apologist in every church. You need at least someone who can point you to apologetic resources.
Right, right.
And that the church doesn't have that, broadly speaking. There's work to be done. All right, now, I didn't tell you about this, Melissa, but we have a segment on our show called Rapid Questions. And
good. Okay.
we have many fans of this segment. We have some people who are like, hey, you got to change it up. But we've been doing it for so long. Chris, how long have we been doing Rapid?
Since the show started.
We've had it since maybe not the first.
Episode 2. The first time.
Episode 2. Chris would know this because he's been uploading all of our past episodes to YouTube as we develop our YouTube channel. And so if you're on YouTube, I want to encourage you to go to our channel. Just go to youtube.com, search Veracity Hill. You'll see us there. What a unique name we have, Veracity Hill. That's good. Good in the search results. Subscribe to our channel. You'll see all of these old episodes coming up through those notifications. Click on the bell as well so you won't miss an episode. Okay, so Melissa, it's a 60-second sort of quick questions. Answer them as quickly as you can. Some scholars have difficulty with this, others don't. They're totally unrelated to the topic today. So if you're ready, I will begin the game clock.
Okay, sure.
All right, here we go. Taco Bell or KFC?
Neither.
Where would you like to live?
Colorado.
With the exception of the computer, what can you hear?
Nothing.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Silence.
What is your spouse's favorite holiday?
Christmas.
Have you seen anything weird lately?
Oh, yeah. So today I saw this painting of an albino peacock wearing pearls.
Huh.
I need it. It was so cool.
What's your favorite movie?
Lord of the Rings.
You're a Texan. Do you drink Dr. Pepper?
No.
When's the last time you swam in a pool?
2 weeks ago.
What color is your bedroom carpet?
Beige.
What's the last thing you bought?
Chick-fil-A. Today.
Pick a fictional character you'd like to meet.
Fictional character I'd like to meet. Dracula.
Dracula, that's a new one. Nice. Why would you want to meet Dracula?
I love classic horror, especially classic, classic vampire tales. I don't like contemporary vampire tales.
So like
but I love
Abe
classic
Lincoln,
ones.
the Vampire Slayer is not exactly...
No.
Hilarious. Okay, I got to follow up with you on the Dr. Pepper issue. People know I'm a big Dr. Pepper fan. You live in Texas. I mean, I said
Yes.
you're a Texan. I don't know if you're originally from there,
Nope.
but you live there now, and I'm sure lots of people drink Dr. Pepper. But why don't...
I don't dislike Dr. Pepper. I actually like it a lot. I just don't drink sodas.
Oh, I see. So maybe sort of one of those... some people are more health conscious than others. So I can't fault you if that's your reasoning. But Dr. Pepper, it does happen to be the best soft beverage on the planet, as Chris rolls his eyes at me when I say that.
Okay, so I'm originally from North Carolina, and I have to say Cheerwine gives Dr. Pepper a run for its money.
I'm sorry, what beverage did you just refer to?
It's called Cheerwine, all one word, CheerWine.
Is this
and it's a soda that's produced in North Carolina. And it doesn't get very widely distributed. It's just been in the past couple years I've been able to find it in specialty markets here in Texas.
I've never heard of it. Cheerwine.
So it's kind of like a hybrid between Dr. Pepper and Cherry Fanta. If you can imagine those two things poured in the same glass, but not cherry Dr. Pepper. It doesn't taste like that. It really tastes like a hybrid.
I was going to say, because, Dr. Pepper's got the cherry Dr. Pepper, so I don't know if that's, but no, it's something different.
Yep.
Chris, next time we go to North Carolina, we might have to hunt that down. Okay, so on our program today, we're talking about science and the mind of the maker with Melissa Cain Travis, the author of this book. We'll be sure to put a link in the description and on our website as well, so you can check it out for yourself. Very down-to-earth, accessible, nothing high-level, which is great. So I'm sure you did a fine job. Some folks are a little bit better at that than others, as I'm sure you know, Melissa. I want to, of course, now get into a bit of the high-level stuff, as I say that. Talking about the design argument, fine-tuning. What does fine-tuning refer to?
Okay, so the idea behind the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God is that when we examine the parameters of the universe, and this is a very simplified explanation, when we examine things like the initial conditions that obtained at the birth of the universe to the best of our knowledge, and when we examine things like the numerical constants that have to be plugged into the laws of nature, what we find is that we have this host of parameters that had to be within a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the values that they actually have in order for the universe to be life permitting. So if any of these deviated even just a hair's breadth, less than a hair's breadth, really, when you think about the numbers, then life would have been impossible. And in many instances, when we do these imaginary universes by fiddling with the numbers, in many of the cases we find there could not have even have been chemistry. So often you'll have someone say, oh, well, you're talking about the conditions necessary for the kind of life that we have. Well, what about all the other possible kinds of life? And our response to that is, no, you don't understand. There wouldn't be stars. There wouldn't be galaxies. There wouldn't even be chemistry. So no kind of life would be possible. And so as the argument goes, it is so extraordinarily unlikely from a probability perspective that everything would line up exactly the way it does and be conducive to intelligent life, that really the only rational explanation is that it was intentional, that there was a designer who dialed all this in just the right way in order for life to exist.
So you, and I appreciated how you sort of explain that when, say, physicists are making their calculations about what it would take. They're sort of in their minds and on really in their minds as they're doing the math, thinking of imaginary or possible worlds to see if it would even work. Now, humans are carbon-based creatures, so when, say, we're watching Guardians of the Galaxy or Star Trek, and we see these other types of creatures which are not carbon-based, what you're telling me, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it the case that those creatures which are based other in some
like silicone-based life?
Yeah, or nitrogen-based, or whatever, right? They just wouldn't exist. Is that right?
Right, because for any kind of life to exist whatsoever, you have to have chemistry, right?
Yeah.
You have to have organisms that can take in energy from their environment and metabolize it and grow and reproduce. And chemistry is essential for any of those things. So with the fine-tuning situation, if you vary one or more of these parameters, even a tiny little bit, then very often you end up with imaginary universes where there could not have even have been chemistry. Some of them, for example, are just a dilute sea of hydrogen atoms. You're not going to get any kind of life if all you have are some hydrogen atoms that are so far apart from each other that they might only bump into one another once every billion years or whatever. You see what I'm saying?
Right. So if the formula were to sort of say, if we could create a silicon-based creature, what happens with the formula is that thing, it just wouldn't happen. You're saying it just wouldn't.
Right. You're not even gonna.
This is some of the most depressing news I've gotten in a long time, because as I'm thinking about all these fantastical worlds, you're saying there's no chance at all.
Right.
But that's sort of what makes the movies fun, is because it's the imagination, it's in our minds.
Right. Yeah. So in the universe that we do have, perhaps there are other kinds of life forms elsewhere in the universe that are not carbon based.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, you have to have a universe where chemistry is even possible.
Where it works. Right. Okay, so there is the possibility that there's some other based life forms.
I would say yes.
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of other Christians would disagree with me. I'm completely comfortable with, for instance, C.S. Lewis's idea that there could be some distant galaxy with other creative
I'm on
life.
the same page.
Yeah, I mean, how awesome would that be?
And how fascinating would it be if they had a similar human narrative as we do, that their species, high level, intelligent, far above the rest of their created order, fell, and there was and the Creator came and tabernacled among them and saved them. I mean, if that's the case, then I'm just like, how can you possibly deny the Christian narrative? If that narrative.
Or it could be like in the story of Paralandra, the second book in C.S. Lewis's Ransom trilogy, where there never was a fall, where there's a human civilization where sin has never even entered the story.
Huh. Oh gosh, and then we're gonna encounter them? Oh no.
Well, I didn't say I thought that was theologically feasible.
Right.
I'm just speculating. Yeah, that's my favorite book of that trilogy.
Yeah.
I like to imagine that.
Okay, so yes, all right, good. I'm glad to know that my whole hope for the future is not taken out by the reality of science. The design argument seems all well and good, but evolution seems like it could explain some of this. Is evolution a theory that sort of puts to rest arguments from natural theology?
I say no. And I don't say that because I think design arguments, how can I put this? So I don't believe whether or not evolutionary theory is true. Let me start there. Whether or not it is true, I do not believe the truth of Christianity hinges on it one way or the other. Okay? I take a very broad... Now, of course, I have a personal leaning from the scientific point of view as to which way I think reality lands. But at the end of the day, I do not think design arguments, the integrity of design arguments, generally speaking, and I mean very generally speaking, I'm not talking about any one specific design argument from biology, but generally speaking, I do not think evolutionary theory undercuts the general idea. So to give a really good example from history, one of Charles Darwin's associates, Dr. Asa Gray. Dr. Asa Gray was a botanist at Harvard University, and he was a contemporary of Darwin. They never met in person, but they corresponded a great deal. And Darwin actually referred to Dr. Gray as his most able advocate in America. So Asa Gray was very pro-natural selection. He thought it was an excellent explanation for the complexity and diversity of life that we observe. But interestingly, he and Darwin completely parted ways on the metaphysical implications of natural selection. So it's often said that the genius of Darwin was that he gave us design without a designer, capital D, meaning he ruled out intelligent design. And even during his own time, there were folks like Dr. Gray who were saying, no, that's ridiculous. Of course, this doesn't rule out design from biological arguments. So Dr. Gray came up with this really fantastic illustration. He said, imagine that you're meeting a woman from centuries past who was in the profession of weaving cloth, and you show her a piece of cloth from contemporary day, and you tell her that human hands did not weave this piece of cloth, that it was this newfangled machine that actually did the weaving. Now, would she then say there was no human design involved, that just because there was a machine that produced the cloth, design was ruled out? And Gray's point is, just because we have a theoretical mechanism in biology to have produced the diversity of species, which what Darwin argued, that doesn't rule out a designer. If anything, it calls for an even more marvelous designer, someone who not only could create something, but who could create wonderful mechanisms that can produce something. So his analogy was someone creating cloth by hand and someone engineering a machine that could produce cloth. I mean, just it's mind-boggling how much more advanced the latter is. So why in the world would we say no intelligence had to be involved with a complex mechanism? And I think Dr. Gray was exactly right on that. I love that argument. But again, I want to reiterate, whether or not evolutionary theory is true, what I'm saying is design arguments are still feasible from a philosophical point of view.
So, could you tell us about the idea of what's called the theory of everything?
Oh, the theory of everything. Okay, so this is an idea in physics. Basically, the situation we find ourselves in is that the Newton's physics that we talked about a little bit earlier and the much, much, much more recent field of quantum physics are mathematically incompatible. So what physicists are still trying to do is find this holy grail that they call a theory of everything. And what this would be is a unified physics. It would be a physics that can explain mathematically the behavior of large things like planets and galaxies, but can also use the same fundamental mathematical principles to explain the behavior of matter at the atomic and subatomic levels, matter and energy at the very micro level. Right now, we don't have a theory that can combine those two in a harmonious way. So some naturalistic scientists and philosophers will try to perpetuate this idea that if we ever got to that point, then everything would be explained, and it would mean that theism is even less likely than it is right now, that science and mathematics altogether will have explained the existence of everything. But that's just a philosophical mistake. It will have done no such thing. All it will have done, to quote one of the scientists who works on the Large Hadron Collider, is to suggest even more powerfully that God is a mathematician and that his creation is coherent. That's what it would tell us.
Einstein said that something like God playing with dice. What did he mean by that phrase? Am I recalling that phrase correctly?
He goes, God does not play dice with the universe, right? So this was Einstein expressing his distaste, if you will, for the idea that there is uncertainty in the quantum world. You may have heard of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Einstein did not think that probabilities at the atomic and subatomic level were the real state of affairs, as quantum physics seems to suggest. He was very, very much a staunch determinist. He was like, we can't have any of this indeterminacy. God does not play dice with the universe.
Yeah, so even Einstein believed that there were these laws, and the laws were laws, and things structured in a certain way. Fascinating. Now, tell us, Einstein's one of the, if not the biggest mind of the 20th century, and people may know him as just, a big physicist. E equals mc squared is typically what people associate with Einstein. Tell us more about him, though, and what E equals mc squared is all about.
Okay, so Einstein was born into a secular Jewish home. And when he was a preteen, he was bona fide genius. He was reading advanced science and philosophy before he even hit his teenage years. So as a preteen, somewhere around the age of 11 or 12, he actually became devoutly religious. So born into a secular Jewish home, but they sent him to a Christian private school. So through his time at the school, he became intensely interested in Christianity. But then when he hit 12, 13 years old, his parents actually invited an exchange student of sorts to come and live in their home. And this was a Jewish young man who was also very secular in his thinking. And Einstein looked at this older student as somewhat of a role model in his life, and was very, very influenced towards naturalism through conversations with this student that lived in their home. And for the rest of his life, the best that I can fathom from what I've studied is that he stuck to this sort of deistic, fuzzy, pantheistic, weird conception of God. He didn't believe in a personal God. He didn't believe that if there was a creator, that creator wanted anything to do with mankind or could have anything to do with mankind. And it's interesting because as a result of that, his life philosophy was very incoherent. He was a pacifist. He adamantly objected to treatment of the Jews, for example. And he wanted to assert this idea of objective morality, but that was inconsistent with his belief that there is no moral lawgiver.
Fascinating. The 20th century saw a sort of revival of the God hypothesis. And even now in the 21st century, there's just sort of a renewed interest, at least from what I perceive. Maybe tell us a little bit about that. What has been getting people more and more interested in, I think Time Magazine, God is Dead. I know that was more philosophical, but there still is this renewed interest in the God hypothesis.
Yeah, I guess maybe about 10 years ago now, Lee Strobel made a comment that we were entering the golden age of Christian apologetics. And that struck me as quite a grandiose claim maybe back then. But then in the ensuing years, I've come to believe that he was really onto something, because we're seeing a remarkable renewal of Christian thought in the discipline of philosophy. We're seeing more and more interest in the theistic implications of science in various disciplines: neuroscience, biochemistry, physics and cosmology, for example. And I think it's very true that the more we learn, the more we uncover the secrets of nature, the complexities of the universe, the complexities of life, the stronger the theistic implications become. And so it seems that the trajectory of scientific advancement is running right parallel with this growing interest in the God hypothesis.
Okay, we've just got a couple minutes left here. Let me ask you this. If you had to give sort of an elevator pitch, an elevator speech for the creator hypothesis, to some, let's say you're riding an elevator with an atheist, how would you winsomely convey that message to the atheist?
How tall is the building?
Let's say we've got a 20-story building.
Okay.
And the elevator goes, she wants to calculate the speed of the elevator.
Oh, goodness. Well, that's a very large order. Being put on the spot in an elevator like that, I don't know what I would say. But I hope I would say, let's start with the fact that anything at all exists and talk about
Arguing from contingency.
Yeah, the argument from contingency. And then the first place I would go after that, and I would probably camp out on, would be, let's talk about all of the circumstances that have to be necessary for the project of science to be possible in the first place. So we could talk about like the physical parameters. What does planet Earth need to be like in order for us to do science? We could talk about human consciousness and rationality. What do those things have to look like in order for science to be possible? We could talk about the applicability of mathematics to nature, something that Einstein thought. He used the word miracle over and over and over again. He said, it is a miracle that the world is even comprehensible. So all of that falls under the umbrella of what I usually refer to as the argument from the comprehensibility of the universe. Because I think if you look at the remarkable convergence of all these things that make it possible for us to even get started doing science, it's just mind-boggling. And at the end of Science in the Mind of the Maker, I mentioned this wonderful quote by G.K. Chesterton, one of my favorite early 20th century intellectuals and Christians. And he says, look, it is not that we have just one kind of evidence that seems to be pointing to the existence of God. It's that we have all different kinds of very different evidence, all pointing in the same direction. And that makes for such a powerful case. And I think when we talk about the comprehensibility of the universe and all the elements that have to go into that, we're seeing the kind of situation Chesterton's talking about, even just within that one sphere. So that would be my elevator speech.
I was going to say, for a little bit there, I felt like I would never want to be the atheist stuck in that elevator. But it seems that the facts are undeniable, the probabilities are undeniable, and for many people, I mean, to want to affirm atheism is just to deny reality, or to accept atheism, to propose it is to deny reality. And that it's just so obvious. And the scripture teaches that too, that, God has made known his attributes for everyone to see. So, everyone will be held accountable as a result of that. So I think in many ways it's unfortunate that we have to talk about even the God hypothesis with people, but at the same time we have to reach people where they're at. And so if people deny that God exists, well, we've got to put forward, hey, here's good reasons for thinking actually that he does. And here's the evidence with a big moving truckload full of, evidence.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, the way I like to put it is if you're going to come at things from a naturalistic worldview, you end up with some brute facts that will never, ever be explained, facts that are outside the purview of scientific investigation. But if you look at it through a lens that is at least open to the idea of theism, you can get explanations that are so much more intellectually satisfying and a more coherent worldview as well. So shouldn't we desire the latter over the former?
Great. Last question here. The story of the cosmos. I had it sitting on my desk. Tell me quickly about that.
Okay, Story of the Cosmos. Awesome. I have one too. It probably will look backwards on my screen. So I am a contributor to Story of the Cosmos. It contains all sorts of wonderful essays from a variety of disciplines. So this is a book that is not just for the science-oriented person or even someone who has any background whatsoever in sciences. There's a wonderful chapter in there on cosmology and fine art. There's a wonderful chapter on C.S. Lewis and cosmology. There's one on J.R.R. Tolkien that is fantastic. William Lane Craig is a contributor, Dr. Holly Ordway, Dr. Michael Ward, who is probably the premier living C.S. Lewis scholar. All sorts of good stuff in there. And my chapters, of course, on Johannes Kepler. And the comprehensibility of the universe and how that points to not just the existence of God, but it also points to man being made in the image of God.
Great. Awesome. Well, we might have to bring you back on just to talk more about that. It sounds quite fascinating.
Sure.
But thank you so much for coming on the program to talk to us about science and the mind of the maker, what the conversation between faith and science reveals about God. And obviously now it's been out for a year, and so the 1-year anniversary just passed, and we'll put a link in the description and at our website where you can check that out by Harvest House Publishers. Thanks so much, Melissa, for coming on the program today.
Oh, thank you for speaking with me.
You bet. God bless you. Well, that does it for our program today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons and the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. And they are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, and Fox Restoration. I want to thank our technical producer, Chris, for all the fine work that he does, and to our guest, Dr. Melissa Cain Travis. And last but not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.